Show something real fast. Today is just going to be a day I'm going to get deep on something for the record. And as always, fair use for the sake of information is
Orthodox
all these
claims of
things.
Christian
I just want to first introduce something before we start a little series. So hopefully y'all will on Monday. We'll get right into that. We'll try to do all these things live so we can have questions and people they have a statement or anything like that to touch on these things. As always, we'll try to do a little 10-minute wait. Unlike today, I'm just going to dive in. It's just for the record, just for some information. I think it's important that the early saints speak for themselves, right? If they were trained by the disciples, their teachings and their ways should reflect the ways of the disciples, right? So I just want to show something real fast, just a little bit of the actual life of the saints and get an idea of the second century saints. The reason why is because um, it's just like cars and stuff like that, right? When cars first came out, you get your first cars, but the only thing is with cars, is evolving. But with saints, they had the perfect way right at the start. So we'll start to notice that the next saints, what they would do is not point to themselves; they're more point to the teachings of the saints previously. Now, I already showed that there were saints in India, saints in Africa, saints in Spain, saints all over the world at different points of time, and we're talking first century. Um, that's soon as Christ, right, 30 AD ish, and we're gonna get the spreading of Christianity in all different areas, right? We're talking all over the Levant and all over Africa, and all over places of Asia and Europe, right? But let's look here because this is what's really important to understand. The saints didn't change the way; they still kept on battling. I'm just going to show an example.
truth. In other words, we're going to look at the earliest Christian heresies. Because as the second century wears on, and as we move closer and closer to the third century, as the persecutions ramp up under the Dominate, what begins to happen is the church has these sort of twin pressures. Internally, it has to deal with the claims of some to certain doctrinal positions. But on the other hand, it has this outward pressure of the intelligentsia, of the opinions of the world around them that they had to contend with. And so in this lecture, we're going to look at both of these pressures. And we're going to begin with the external pressure, and we're going to talk about the apologists who tried to meet that pressure head on. And we don't really have to belabor the point about what was being said about Christianity. On the one hand, we've talked about this a good bit in the past already in other lectures on persecution and on Roman paganism, and just simply how the Roman world had instincts against the Christian faith on a number of fronts. We don't really have to rehash all of the arguments used against Christianity. What I want to focus on now, though, is who were the apologists and what were their tactics or what was their tone when they engaged with the outside world. And I want to highlight three figures in particular as sort of the foremost of the apologists. And they are Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Origen. Now, each of these figures, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Origen, each have something to contribute theologically as well as in terms of their apologetics. But we're going to bracket out their theology for the moment. But I want you to know we're going to pick that back up in later lectures, particularly when we get into the 3rd and 4th century arguments about the Trinity and about Christology. Because a lot of the threads of, say, the Nicene Creed and the debates that led up to the Council of Chalcedon, etc., were already there in the 2nd century. In fact, they go all the way back to Scripture, I'll say, when we get to those lectures. But we don't want to say everything right now about these figures, and right now we're just simply talking about their apologetics. But these three figures in particular, he takes a very charitable tone throughout the text. He's not very scathing or nasty towards his opponent. Said for our second person, who is Tertullian. Tertullian is sort of this curmudgeon.
Okay, so we're going to hear about Tertullian. We're going to talk about Tertullian. So Tertullian, what's interesting about Tertullian, he was basically going at it against the Gnostics and stuff. That's very important. Just to get a little understanding on Tertullian, right? He's going to be in Africa, right? He's a Latin speaker, right? He's converted. Um, a lot of times he's known as basically one of the major ones of, like, they'll even say is quote unquote father of Latin Christianity, right? That's very important. But he was basically against heresies, and he's known in history to be basically um, very, very direct, right? Sometimes people don't like the way he approached things, but he goes at things really hard, right? He goes at it hard and blunt sometimes. But let me show you a little bit about him as we continue.
Origen of the ancient world, the second century. And he has so much to contribute theologically and intellectually to this world, but his tone with just about everybody is simply nasty and bitter. Tertullian takes a more ancient tactic, which was not uncommon in the day, of simply mocking his opponents. This is the same tactic that Celsus uses. And it's actually telling that historians have pointed out that there are not many other patristic scholars, any of his contemporaries, who actually cite Tertullian as a person of repute that they actually want to model themselves after. He's kind of the bad boy. It actually takes Augustine at a later generation, a later century, to sort of rehab and to really cite Tertullian as a real sort of powerful person that he considers to be an authoritative voice. And there are lots of reasons for this, which we'll get into in a minute. But Tertullian takes a more acerbic tone when he's taking on his pagan opponents. The last person we'll just mention by name is Origen.
All right, so always remember these. A lot of these images are late images, right? A lot of these images are late images. But now let's talk about these individuals real fast. So, like we was talking about Tertullian, we're gonna actually hear one of his writings. Let's hear what is said, what he says in his writings. I just want to talk about basically what these saints talked about and let them speak for themselves, right? Let's let them speak for themselves on what they were dealing with and what life was like in their time. So here's a little setting, right? We already made it clear that during the time of Nero, right? During the time of Nero, a lot of the saints were being persecuted. We can contest to that. We can show historical facts for that. We got a lot of things from Tacitus and a lot of things from other writers that let us know Christians were there early 64 AD. Now, here's a little later. Let's see if anything changed, right?
To Scapula by Tertullian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. We are not in any great perturbation or alarm about the persecutions we suffer from the ignorance of men, for we have attached ourselves to this sect, fully accepting the terms of its covenant, so that, as men whose very lives are not their own, we engage in these conflicts, our desire being to obtain God's promised rewards, and our dread lest the woes with which he threatens an unchristian life should overtake us. So we shrink not from the grapple with your utmost rage, coming even forth of our own accord to the contest, and condemnation gives us more pleasure than acquittal. We have sent therefore this tract to you, in no alarm about ourselves, but in much concern for you and for all our enemies, to say nothing of our friends. For our religion commands us to love even our enemies, and to pray for those who persecute us, aiming at a perfection all its own, and seeking in its disciples something of a higher type than the commonplace goodness of the world. For all love those who love them. It is peculiar to Christians alone to love those that hate them. Therefore, mourning over your ignorance, and compassionating human error, and looking on to that future of which every day shows threatening signs, necessity is laid on us to come forth in this way also, that we may set before you the truths you will not listen to openly and publicly. We are worshippers of one God, of whose existence and character nature teaches all men, at whose lightnings and thunders you tremble, whose benefits minister to your happiness. You think that others too are gods, the same we know to be devils. However, it is a fundamental human right, a privilege of nature, that every man should worship according to his own convictions. One man's religion neither harms nor helps another man. It is assuredly no part of religion to compel religion, to which free will and not force should lead us, the sacrificial victims even being required of a willing mind. You will render no real service to your gods by compelling us to sacrifice, for they can have no desire of offerings from the unwilling, unless they are animated by a spirit of contention, which is a thing altogether undivine.
All right, so for the record, I don't know if you caught what he just said. So he's obviously making it obvious that the person who accepts Christianity must accept it willingly, right? They must choose by faith, which is the hardest way to bring forth the gospel, that one individual must accept it by choice, not by force, but by choice. If this was something that was brought by the Romans, it would be by force, right? Everyone has to do it. But this is by choice, that everyone has to be willing, right? They have to choose to do it by faith, right? From the gospel, from the words of the gospel. So he's going on and letting them know that it's still by this. And he's letting them know there is another spirit that is by basically force. And they say it's not even a holy thing, one that controls in the way of force, right? Very important. So you can hear that what he just said. I'm going to go back a little bit so you can hear that real fast again.
Of contention, which is a thing altogether undivine. Us, the sacrificial victims even being required of a willing mind. You will render no real service to your gods by compelling us to sacrifice, for they can have no desire of offerings from the unwilling, unless they are animated by a spirit of contention, which is a thing altogether undivine. Accordingly, the true God bestows his blessings alike on wicked men and on his own elect, upon which account he has appointed an eternal judgment, when both thankful and unthankful will have to stand before his bar. Yet you have never detected us, sacrilegious wretches though you reckon us to be, in any theft, far less in any sacrilege. But the robbers of your temples, all of them swear by your gods and worship them. They are not Christians, and yet it is they who are found guilty of sacrilegious deeds. We have not time to unfold how many other ways your gods are mocked and despised by their own votaries. So, too, treason is falsely laid to our charge, though no one has ever been able to find followers of Albinus or Niger or Cassius among Christians, while the very men who had sworn by the genie of the emperor, who had offered and vowed sacrifices for their safety, who had often pronounced condemnation on Christ's disciples, are till this day found traitors to the imperial throne. A Christian is enemy to none, least of all to the Emperor of Rome, whom he knows to be appointed by his God, and so cannot but love and honour, and whose well-being, moreover, he must needs desire, with that of the empire over which he reigns, so long as the world shall stand, for so long as that shall Rome continue. To the emperor, therefore, we render such reverential homage as is lawful for us and good for him, regarding him as the human being next to God, who from God has received all his power, and is less than God alone.
Now, it's important to note that this saint is writing, right, the same writings that Paul wrote, all the other saints have wrote. And what he's saying here, he's letting us know, right, without a doubt. Let's go back. He's letting us know that he himself is saying that they're praying for the safety of the leaders of the place, but he said that they are under God. He said that they are not above God. That's very important. So he's not putting the leaders above God, but he's putting the leaders under God. That's very important. So like the Caesars and stuff, right? They're underneath God. He's not putting them above. That's very important. That was never the message of the belief. The belief was never to put any man above the Most High Yah. That's very important. That's the truth of Christianity, all the way to its root, all the way to the origins of it, right? That's something to always remember, that they're uplifting one God. That's very important. That when Christ came, remember, this was God himself in the flesh. A lot of people don't understand this. Christ says it himself, right? Give me the glory that I had with you since the beginning, right? What was his separation from him, right? You got to understand the whole thing, what's going on, the Father and Son understanding, right? He sits at the right hand of himself. It's talked about in the Psalms, right? God, right? Even thy God has anointed thee with oil of gladness above thy fellows, right? But let's continue.
and this will be according to his own desires. For thus, as less only than the true God, he is greater than all besides. Thus he is greater than the very gods themselves, even they too being subject to him. We therefore sacrifice for the emperor's safety, but to our God and his, but after the manner God has enjoined, in simple prayer. For God, creator of the universe, has no need of odours or of blood. These things are the food of devils. But we not only reject those wicked spirits, we overcome them, we hold them up daily to contempt, we exorcise them from their victims, as multitudes can testify. So all the more we pray for the imperial well-being, as those who seek it at the hands of him who is able to bestow it. And one would think it must be abundantly clear to you that the religious system under whose rules we act is one inculcating a divine patience. Since, though our numbers are so great, constituting all but the majority in every city, we conduct ourselves so quietly and modestly. I might perhaps say, known rather as individuals than as organized communities, and remarkable only for the reformation of our former vices. For far be it from us to take it ill that we have laid on us the very things we wish, or in any way plot the vengeance at our own hands, which we expect to come from God. However, as we have already remarked, it cannot but distress us that no state shall bear unpunished the guilt of shedding Christian blood, as you see indeed in what took place during the presidency of Hilarion.
All right. So what's important? So what's important about what just happened here? We got to understand. He just said anyone who kills a Christian, right, won't be innocent of the punishment that will come to them. So what he would be condemning is Rome. That's very important. Just in that line alone, he would be condemning Rome. And he even says that they would continue until God's coming. That Rome will continue until God's coming, and it'll be destroyed. Now we got to understand that understanding of Rome, right? Next after Rome was iron and clay, right? The kingdom of the quote unquote the Germanic Holy Roman Empire that came, right? But remember, that was a Germanic nation that came together, the Holy Roman Empire, right? At first being France, the split of that, making it the parts of Germany and stuff, but at the split of Rhine and everything, right? The so-called Holy Roman Empire. That's very important. Not all the way Roman, not all the way an empire, and obviously not holy. But we got to understand that that was later. That was way later. The time when you get Constantine and a lot of the actual emperors actually start to get involved with the stuff was later. But early on, you get the saints. He's showing how they were living quiet lives, right? And letting them know that anyone who would kill them, right, they're basically doing themselves an injustice, that the judgment will be on them on a high degree. But let's continue because he's letting them know that there were people dying in that time. But he's going to get detail into that and the separation between them and the worshipers of Jupiter and stuff like that. Sometimes you'll see some weird, crazy combinations when people play with the Messiah's name. We'll talk about that. Maybe y'all willing tomorrow. We'll talk about um, the linguistic understanding of the changing of the name. Why today we see the name, many people say Jesus with a J, but that word Jesus, that J, even that J, the letter J, if you know about linguistics, the letter J, if you trace his roots, it came from the letter I, which is really interesting. You get that in genetics too. I and J were one. But I and J were one, but the I and the J sound had a similar sound, right? In fact, I used to have a J sound. It's very important. I used to have a J sound, but then they made a separate um, type of text for it. The J, the letter J is recent. You can look it up. The letter J is recent to the English language, right? Even English, at first, it was an I. That I made a J sound. You can still see that with Spanish. As anyone who speaks Spanish, we know linguistics. There's a lot of letters that's J that makes an I sound, right? That's very important in linguistics. That's how it was in the land of Greece, right? That's very important. That's another connection, a different connection. We'll go into another time, but very important to understand how these first saints were when they were talking. Let's let them continue.
For when there had been some agitation about places of sepulture for our dead, and the cry arose, no area, no burial grounds for the Christians, it came about that their own area, their threshing floors, were a wanting, for they gathered in no harvests. As to the reigns of the bygone year, it is abundantly plain of what they were intended to remind men, of the deluge, no doubt, which in ancient times overtook human unbelief and wickedness. And as to the fires which lately hung all night over the walls of Carthage, they who saw them know what they threatened, and what the preceding thunders pealed, they who were hardened by them can tell. All these things are signs of God's impending wrath, which we must needs publish and proclaim in every possible way, and in the meanwhile we must pray it may be only local. Sure are they to experience it one day in its universal and final form who interpret otherwise these samples of it. That sun, too, in the metropolis of Utica, with light all but extinguished, was a portent which could not have occurred from an ordinary eclipse, situated as the Lord of Day was in his height and house. You have the astrologers, consult them about it. We can point you also to the deaths of some provincial rulers who in their last hours had painful memories of their sin in persecuting the followers of Christ. Vigellus Saturninus, who first here used the sword against us, lost his eyesight. Claudius Lucius Herminianus in Cappadocia, enraged that his wife had become a Christian, had treated the Christians with great cruelty. Well, left alone in his palace, suffering under a contagious malady, he boiled out in living worms, and was heard exclaiming, "Let nobody know of it, lest the Christians rejoice, and Christian wives take encouragement." Afterwards he came to see his error in having tempted so many from their steadfastness by the tortures he inflicted, and died almost a Christian himself. In that doom which overtook Byzantium, Caelius Capella could not help crying out, "Christians, rejoice!" Yes, and the persecutors, who seem to themselves to have acted with impunity, shall not escape the day of judgment. For you, we sincerely wish it may prove to have been a warning only, that immediately after you had condemned Mavalus of Adrumetum to the wild beasts, you were overtaken by those troubles, and that even now, for the same reason, you are being called to a blood reckoning. But do not forget the future. We who are without fear ourselves are not seeking to frighten you, but we would save all men if possible by warning them not to fight with God. You may perform the duties of your charge and yet remember the claims of humanity. If on no other ground than that you are liable to punishment yourself, you ought to do so. For is not your commission simply to condemn those who confess their guilt and to give over to the torture those who deny? You see, then, how you trespass yourself against your instructions to wring from the confessing a denial. It is, in fact, an acknowledgment of our innocence that you refuse to condemn us at once when we confess. In doing your utmost to extirpate us, if that is your object, it is innocence you assail. But how many rulers, men more resolute and more cruel than you are, have contrived to get quit of such causes altogether? As Cincius Severus, who himself suggested the remedy at Thystris, pointed out how the Christians should answer that they might secure an acquittal, as Vespronius Candidus, who dismissed from his bar a Christian on the ground that to satisfy his fellow citizens would break the peace of the community, as Asper, who, in the case of a man who gave up his faith under slight infliction of the torture, did not compel the offering of a sacrifice, having owned before, among the advocates and assessors of court, that he was annoyed at having to meddle with such a case. Pudens, too, at once dismissed a Christian who was brought before him, perceiving from the indictment that it was a case of vexatious accusation. Tearing the document to pieces, he refused so much as to hear him without the presence of his accuser, as not being consistent with the imperial commands. All this might be officially brought under your notice, and by the very advocates who are themselves also under obligations to us, although in court they give their voices as it suits them. For the clerk of one of them who was liable to be thrown upon the ground by an evil spirit was set free from his affliction, as was also the relative of another, and the little boy of a third. And how many men of rank, to say nothing of common people, have been delivered from devils and healed of diseases? Even Severus himself, the father of Antonin, was graciously mindful of the Christians, for he sought out the Christian Proculus, surnamed Torpatian, the steward of Euodius, and in gratitude for his having once cured him by anointing, he kept him in his palace till the day of his death. Antonin, too, brought up as he was on Christian milk, was intimately acquainted with this man. Both women and men of highest rank, whom Severus knew well to be Christians, were not merely permitted by him to remain uninjured, but he even bore distinguished testimony in their favour, and gave them publicly back to us from the hands of a raging populace. Marcus Aurelius also, in his expedition to Germany, by the prayers his Christian soldiers offered to God, got rain in that well-known thirst. When indeed have not droughts been put away by our kneelings and our fastings? At times like these, moreover, the people crying to the God of gods, the alone omnipotent, under
All right, so pay attention. Pay attention to what he's about to say here. So he's going to make it clear that all those things he did for Christ, but he's going to make it clear that there were still those who were calling Zeus God of gods, and they are separating themselves from that sect. It's very important that he doesn't link them together with Zeus. That's very important. So pay attention to what he's saying here, what he's going to say here concerning the idols.
the name of Jupiter, have borne witness to our God. People crying to the God of gods, the alone omnipotent, under the name of Jupiter, have borne witness to our God. Then we never deny the deposit placed in our hands, we never pollute the marriage bed, we deal faithfully, when indeed have not droughts been put away by our kneelings and our fastings.
Okay, so it was a real fast saying. I don't know if you caught it, but let me open up a note here. As it's been noted for a long time, right, that Jupiter was a rename of the idol Zeus. It's very important that the Romans had a lot of beliefs that the Greeks had, right? We was knowing this before when we was talking about the historicity of the world and stuff, and talk about how people were taking religions and ideas from each other and whatnot. But the belief of Christ, right? The prophesied Messiah in Daniel 9, right? If you don't know about the 70 weeks prophecy, it's very important to know about that. The 70 weeks prophecy, right? Daniel 9 talks about these things, right? It's very, very important when it goes over those things. But let me show you something concerning combinations in time, right? You can see with different things, like for example, right, when you get the time of the Greeks, you'll get the Romans there. What the Romans did, they took Zeus and renamed Zeus Jupiter, right? Poseidon to Neptune, right? Hades to Pluto, and Hermes to Mercury, etc., right? That's very important to understand that the time of the Greeks, right? The time of the Greeks were highly influenced by Rome, right? That's very very important. That's very 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 important that the time of the Greeks were being very influenced by Rome. Um, with that understood, this saint is mentioning that they wasn't influenced by Rome. In fact, they show that the people that were still influenced by Rome, they themselves are separate from them, right? They was dealing with these people for a long time, people that were Gnostics and things like that. But let's keep on hearing what he's saying here. So again, I went a little bit back so you can hear him saying that he has nothing to do with Jupiter, right? Jupiter, Zeus, and all that.
At times like these, moreover, the people crying to the God of gods, the alone omnipotent, under the name of Jupiter, have borne witness to our God. Then we never deny the deposit placed in our hands, we never pollute the marriage bed, we deal faithfully with our wards, we give aid to the needy, we render to none evil for evil. As for those who falsely pretend to belong to us, and whom we too repudiate, let them answer for themselves. In a word, who has complaint to make against us on other grounds? To what else does the Christian devote himself save the affairs of his own community, which, during all the long period of its existence, no one has ever proved guilty of the incest or the cruelty charged against it? It is for freedom from crime so singular, for a probity so great, for righteousness, for purity, for faithfulness, for truth, for the living God, that we are consigned to the flames. For this is a punishment you are not wont to inflict either on the sacrilegious, or on undoubted public enemies, or on the treason-tainted, of whom you have so many. Nay, Even now our people are enduring persecution from the governors of Legio and Mauritiania.
So now this saint, he's still expressing that this set is going through persecutions worse than traitors of Rome. They're saying that they're going through worse things than traitors of Rome because of truth. And he's saying that even the governors of the area are against them. Many of the governors of the area are against them. That's something that important to understand about Christianity. The true origin of Christianity, they were always being oppressed. It wasn't something that was made by a higher power. Because if something was made by a higher power, what does that mean? If a higher power makes it, they make a smooth selling, right? They'll make a smooth selling way for them to do it. Think about when Trump was building the wall. When Trump wanted to build a wall, did anyone go over there? Well, you get a lot of people complaining, but because he had power over the nation, did you see any other power in this nation stand in his way when he was building that wall? Even though the wall is not completely finished because the next president didn't want to finish it, but yet during the time of his building, he was allowed to build it all. He's building a wall, though. That's easier to do than building people, right? To build up Christianity, you're building with people. Building with walls and stones is easier than building with people. There's no person who would start an organization and kill their own members. Well, besides those who are crazy, like those who have people drink the Kool-Aid, whatnot. But I'm talking about people in the sense of an emperor, right? An emperor, if an emperor was to develop Christianity, that emperor wouldn't also kill his subjects, right? Because they are his subjects to increase the task of the goal of increasing Christianity. But no, we actually see that Rome and many other governors of many different areas were against the Christians. They were being persecuted. But the Christians weren't turning away from the truth of the gospel, right? And this is just one example. And this is only like first, second century to get an example that they still kept the order of the way, right? And they was still being persecuted, making a separation between the idols of the land, like Jupiter and Zeus, right? Saying they have nothing to do with those. And even he's going to talk about have nothing to do with the festival days with them, right? He's saying have nothing to do with those people, but walk with the Most High Yah, right? He's speaking about walking with the God of the Bible. Now, you got to understand that the first century saints, they understood that the Messiah, the Most High, and the Spirit are one. That's very important. That it was God Himself that actually suffered for us all. That Messiah is the Son of God because He Himself, through Christ, right, made Himself a body to sacrifice. A lot of people don't know that. That body that He made to sacrifice is a sacrifice for those who believe, right? But this one is going deeper into depth into those things. But let's continue on. You can see that he's going through those persecutions and talk about how even some were dying, even being treated worse than an infidel or a person who was a traitor of Rome, right? Going through worse persecutions. Because remember what Nero did. It's very important what Nero did. If you gotta know the details of what he did to the Christians in that time, and they weren't giving up their faith, even though they were standing in the midst of it all.
But it is only with the sword, as from the first it was ordained that we should suffer. But the greater our conflicts, the greater our rewards. Your cruelty is our glory. Only see you to it that in having such things as these to endure, we do not feel ourselves constrained to rush forth to the combat, if only to prove that we have no dread of them, but on the contrary, even invite their infliction. When Arius Antonius was driving things hard in Asia, the whole Christians of the province, in one united band, presented themselves before his judgment seat, on which, ordering a few to be led forth to execution, he said to the rest, O miserable men, if you wish to die, you have precipices or halters. If we should take it into our heads to do the same thing here, what will you make of so many thousands, of such a multitude of men and women, persons of every sex and every age and every rank, when they present themselves before you? How many fires, how many swords will be required? What will be the anguish of Carthage itself, which you will have to decimate, as each one recognizes there his relatives and companions, as he sees there it may be men of your own order and noble ladies, and all the leading persons of the cities, either kinsmen or friends of those of your own circle. Spare thyself, if not us poor Christians. Spare Carthage, if not thyself. Spare the province, which the indication of your purpose has subjected to the threats and extortions at once of the soldiers and of private enemies. We have no master but God. He is before you, and cannot be hidden from you, but to him you can do no injury. But those whom you regard as masters are only men, and one day they themselves must die. Yet this community will be undying, for be assured that just in the time of its seeming overthrow, it is built up into greater power. For all who witness the noble patience of its martyrs, as struck with misgivings, are inflamed with desire to examine into the matter in question, and as soon as they come to know the truth, they straightway enroll themselves its disciples. End of To Scapula by Tertullian.
So you see what he's saying? He basically just said, right? Tertullian's basically saying that he's a disciple of truth. That's what he's saying. He's saying that these believers, as they before have been dying because of the truth, they're still fighting and they're still moving for the sake of truth. That's very important. That's very, very important. So that's what he's letting them know. He's letting you know that he himself, he chooses to stand for truth, right? And then what happens later on, right? How does the gospel get canonized and get spread out from multiple places, right? Council of Nicaea, right? Just want to show a piece of it. A lot of people, they probably seen this before, but I just want to make a highlight here.
The Council of Nicaea. Before this occurred, there were several different competing views of Christ. Then the Emperor Constantine assembled them all together to decide on one view of Christ. They met for days, fighting and bickering, until finally the current view of Christianity won, and the divinity of Christ was declared. Then the new Orthodox view used its power to stomp out and erase all other competing views of Christianity. Or so we're told. You know, I hear this story a lot from atheists, cults, Muslims, and several other non-Christian groups. They always give me this generic story to try to show me that the Council of Nicaea made up the divinity of Jesus and created a new version of Christianity. However, this is all I ever hear, this generic story. I never get any more details from skeptics, and there's a good reason why. Because when we study the details of what happened before, during, and after the council met, this fable is easily debunked, and we see that Christ's divinity was not made up at the council. So let's start with events that led up to the council. On February 24th, in 303 AD, the worst persecution of Christians began under the Emperor Diocletian and lasted until Emperor Galerius finally issued a general edict of tolerance in 311 AD. 2 years later, in 313 AD, with the Edict of Milan, the Emperor Constantine finally legalized Christianity and allowed its practice. Now I want to stop here and make sure this point is clear. Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire. He simply commanded official tolerance of Christianity. He did, however, outlaw Jews from stoning Christians and gladiator shows, although they did persist until the 5th century. It wasn't until 380 AD, under the Emperor Theodosius, that Christianity was left as the only legal religion. Shortly after Christianity was made legal, a pastor from Alexandria named Arius began preaching the idea that Jesus was not God, but a created being. He gained a following and began disputing with Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria. So in 321 AD, a local council declared Arius a heretic. However, Arius just moved to Palestine, where he gained a larger following, and over the course of the next few years, the debate became so intense that it gained the attention of Emperor Constantine. Constantine, who had just unified the empire, didn't want anything that would threaten division. He saw the debate between the Christians and Arians as a threat to the stability of the empire, so he moved to settle it. He officially called the council in 325 AD. There were no Gnostics involved, there were no Ebionites involved, or any other groups. The council was called to settle disputes between Christians and Arians only. Most other heretical views of Christianity, like Gnosticism, had mostly died out by this point, and the majority of those professing to be Christians were Orthodox Christians.
All right, I want to say there, the reason why is because Gnostics, right, the time of Gnostics, the peak, the writing that I just showed you was during a time that Gnostics, the writing of Gnostics was at their peak. Now, Gnosticism came a little earlier is even traced during the time when the disciples were there in the book of Acts, right? Dealing with some of the magicians at that time and their own ideas of the things. But a lot of times when you think of those Gnostics, they stopped, right? About 300s. They weren't there. Then you get the Council of Nicaea, which were different people. Believers,
There was
right?
not
Christians, the thing about believers, they always deal with something in throughout time, right? If you're going to be a believer, you're going to suffer some type of persecution. There's always going to be a strong believer out there some at that point of time, though. A believer that knows the history, knows a little more than just the average book opener, right? They themselves are committed to it and they're digging deep and they're continuing in it. And sometimes those individuals, they might seem like they have a different, like an isolated life, but it's like that. When you're in training, and then the time that the battle comes, that's when whatever you had harvest comes into use, right? So it's very important to understand that those that have the responsibility of truth to spread truth and bring truth righteously, right? But what's important to understand that throughout time, right? Believers have been going to persecution for a long time, and the groups that were over them, right? When you think of the people that were over them, you got to remember that the different groups and different time that are battling with the believers contest to the fact that the believers were standing to the exact way of the gospel, the exact words, right? Otherwise, if it was just smooth sailing, never had any other contenders, then you're not really seeing what is described as what the gospel describes, right? That people will carry their cross, right? The types of things that they'll be going through, the types of deeds that they'll be doing. They're doing those deeds and they're doing those things and they're having those conversations, right? It's a war on truth. That's what it is. It's a war on truth. And because of that war, you'll see multiple different pieces in time that will contest these things. As it said early on, right? John 1, 1 John 1 and 2, it says, for the life was manifest, right? Manifest, revealed, right? We have seen it and bear witness and show you that eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifest to us. So, with that, family, just want to go over that. With that, be blessed, be beloved,